Well, hello. Welcome to church. What grinds your gears? That's a good one. That's a real good one. In fact, we're talking about being angry today. So it's actually a really good one because we're going to talk a bit together about the reality that anger is a real emotion and what do we do with it and is it okay and when is it okay and all of that stuff. And so this last week, interestingly, there was a flight that didn't take off. You ever been in one of those situations where you're in an airplane and you're just like, can we leave now? You know? And you just sort of taxi a little bit and then you're stuck and they're like, oh, and we can't turn the air on, sorry. And so you're smelling exhaust every once in a while, but it's getting hot and it's uncomfortable. Or maybe you finally land and you have this scenario where they're like, oh, they don't have a gate open for us. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Has this happened? Yeah, of course, right? That really grinds my gears. I don't know. Like that, you want to talk about grinding gears, like that plane needs to fix its gears so that I can be okay, you know? In fact, there was a story from last week about a man who, he eventually got arrested, so there's that. Maybe don't follow his advice, but there was a flight in Mexico that was 3 hours delayed, but the people were already on the plane, right? And so finally, everyone's riled up, they're angry and all of this, right? And so what do? They have a guy who's like, I'm gonna take care of this. I'm gonna get this done, right? They're so angry, they gotta take action, you know? And here's what he does. He opens the emergency exit because that's something to do. And then he walks on the wing of the plane. Like literally walks out like, oh, here's a diving board. Like, and he gets arrested, as one does, you know? But here's what's wild about it. It was like he was just modeling some collective anger from the plane because the whole plane has written a joint statement in support of the rebel. What? I know. Apple News, by the way, just gives me these stories. I don't know. I just got to swipe there when I'm waking up in the morning like, oh, that might be a sermon illustration. You know, anyway. Yeah, and I just thought, whoa. You know, in Mexico, I grew up in California, so a little bit of Spanish here or there, right? And I think the phrase they would use is, Viva la revolucion, right? Like, yeah, let's go. Let's go. Let's go. That's what we would say. Anger, yeah, it comes up, and how do we manage it? Maybe you felt like this guy from a famous movie. Yeah, the Inside Out guy, where it's just like, the anger button just must be pressed, right? Something grinds your gears, I get it. Or maybe driving, you know, this is always a good example. We talk about this, right? Maybe you're like, this guy, he just looks a little uncomfortable. He looks a little upset, you know. And of course, like we get angry, and the question often is like, how do we manage this emotion, right? And one of the problems with anger is that we actually don't often manage it. We don't actually like say, what is anger telling me in this moment, right? Is it telling me something about myself? Is it telling me something about the situation? Is it telling me something about the other party, maybe? And the problem with not really testing it and not really wrestling with what our anger is that what we can do with anger can be lethal, right? Like anger can lead to all of the worst stuff. Anger can lead us to dehumanize another person, to stand up for our rights when really we're standing up for the wrong thing, right? And at times, we really use anger to feel better about something that's wrong within us. Now, this isn't always true, and we're going to unpack that, but often we really don't wrestle with, like, why am I angry? And not just like, this thing happened, but is there a thing under the thing, under the thing, under the thing? That maybe there's something so deep down there that I've never processed. That anger happens and it always feels like a surprise. It always comes out of nowhere. But actually, deep down in my soul, my spirit, my inner self, there's something I just haven't touched because it's a little bit scary to go that far down. What I want to encourage us to consider today is this one idea. That we ought to be people who are known for this. We're people who are known for test your anger against the weight of your love. Test your anger against the weight of your love. And anger is a natural reaction. So, if you get angry and then you're like, oh, wait, and you kind of do a couple breaths and you're like, okay, I see why I reacted that way. That's a normal sort of reaction that people are built for. Like you're going to get angry. But what we do with it really matters. And what fuels it really matters. Because if we get into a cycle of just, I get angry and it's okay and I'm just angry, I'm just an angry person sometimes. Why do you want to live that way? Why do you want to be that way? Why do you want to be sort of like just self-justifying and just say, I just get angry. That's fine. I go make amends eventually. We got to counterweight our anger with love. And we're going to talk about that for the next few moments. In fact, I believe that this emotion of anger can lead to love. And it can be driven by love, but we really have to be wise about how we step into it. So I want to read you one sort of opening passage just so we can get it on the table. And then we're going to look at the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark and really break down how did Jesus deal with anger and what made him angry. Because if we can look at it in the life of Jesus, maybe, just maybe, we're going to be able to start looking at it in our own sort of lives. So first passage I want to look at really quick before we get to Mark. This is Ephesians chapter 4. It's a somewhat well-known passage, but I think it's really important. Verse 26, it says this of Ephesians 4. It says, be angry without sinning. Or another translation might say, in your anger, do not sin, right? So anger in and of itself here isn't called out as wrong. Like the emotion of anger is part of our wiring. And so the Apostle Paul writing this says, look, when you're angry, manage it this way. Don't let anger lead to the kinds of things that cause harm, essentially. And he says, don't let the sun set on your anger. Don't provide an opportunity for the devil. In other words, your anger has to be managed. Your anger has to be submitted to Jesus. And if you can do that, it changes so much. Changes so much about your life, your situation. And so that, my friends, is what we're going to talk about. We're going to look at the life of Jesus in 3 moments, 3 snapshots where anger is present, and we're going to ask, what's the motivating factor here? What seems to be the reason for anger to emerge? And so we'll start early in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3. And this is what Mark wrote. Jesus returned to the synagogue. A man with a withered hand was there, wanting to bring charges against Jesus. They were watching Jesus closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. So they being the religious leaders, the religious elite, the guardians of the status quo. Verse 3 says, he said to the man with the withered hand, step up where people can see you. I love this line, right? Step up where people can see you. You are an outsider. You who have this illness that kind of keeps you on the boundaries of our culture, the boundaries of society, and you who is being dehumanized in this moment because the religious leaders around me are more concerned with Jesus checking the box than actually loving a human who's right there in that moment, right? And so Jesus actually says, get up, like I want people to see you. When you're suffering, Jesus wants you to know that you are seen. And it keeps going because Jesus is going to really step into this. He says, then he said to them, is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they said nothing. It kind of reminds you of that story when in John's gospel in chapter 8, when the men are caught with stones in their hand and they're ready to kill a woman because they think they can take their anger and wrath out on this woman, right? Like they eventually are just like, They drop the stones. They walk away because they're stumped. So these guys aren't going to engage with Jesus. They're just going to keep watching and see if they find him in a trap. And so verse 5, this is what it says about Jesus. Looking around at them with anger, deeply grieved at their unyielding hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he did, and his hand was made healthy. So something is wrong with his hand. Jesus says, stretch it out. And I can't imagine being there, but what a beautiful image, right? He stretches it out, and it's like just new creation happening on his hand, right? A sign of God's future restored world happened to his hand. It's an amazing moment. And so he stretches it out. And in verse 6, it says, at that, the Pharisees got together with the supporters of Herod to plan how to destroy Jesus, right? They're always out to destroy Jesus. They want to stop his movement. They think it's the best thing for their nation. And notice a couple of things here. I want us to notice that, first of all, Jesus is said to have been angry. And if you look up the Greek word that is there, it means angry. It means like fiery passion, right? Like this is a word that is all about the emotion of anger. So Jesus gets angry. But notice what is paired with it here. I thought this was so fascinating. It's paired with grief. In fact, Jesus held anger and grief together with actions toward righting a wrong. Right, so when we talk about this idea of test your anger against the weight of your love, in this moment, we see Jesus doing exactly that. He's not flying off the handle. He's not doing something with his anger that's destructive. He's using his anger to fuel his grief, and the grief is towards the enemies in the situation, right? Like he grieves for their unyielding hearts, and he takes that and says, in the midst of anger, I'm going to show you that wrongs can be righted, can be fixed, can be put back together. The brokenness of this man's situation can be brought into holy alignment. And I know in life, right? Like it's really hard to sometimes, like when we're wrestling with like our own emotions and what triggers our emotions, like Jesus could have laid into them. Jesus could have dehumanized those guys. And Jesus, at times has some really clear words for them. And by the way, I think most of the time, clarity is actually kind, right? Being clear rather than sort of like holding back, like like passive aggressive, whatever. Like clarity is kind, and Jesus will be clear in other situations. But here the clarity is that Jesus does what they don't want him to do. And he says, look, anger, I have it. Grief, I have it. Why? Because he is loaded with love. It's fueled by love. In other words, we got to notice that when Jesus is angry, he sees an injustice. He sees someone who's on the margin. He sees someone who doesn't fit the mold, the boxes, the religiosity of the moment. And instead of saying, well, we don't usually do healings on Sundays, so maybe later this week when I have a marginal space in my calendar, we can kind of book this thing and we can sync up and we'll talk about the hand thing. His anger leads him to do the right thing in the right moment. I find this fascinating, and it's going to come up in various ways in the other two stories. So the second story I want to talk about is found in Mark chapter 10. And it'll be familiar to us because we talked about this passage during our Growing Young series that we did, right? Where we were talking about sort of the family life stuff. And it's the second time we see Jesus angry in a clear way in the Gospel of Mark. People were bringing children to Jesus. Some of you are like, oh yeah, I've got enough of those. Or some of you are like, yeah, kids, we're hard. It's hard sometimes. Yeah, fair enough. But Jesus is there, and people were bringing children to Jesus so that he would bless them. So that he would bless them. But the disciples scolded them. The adult, like, Mom, Dad, like, why would you bring babies to Jesus? They can't even understand him, you know? Like, they're not really, they're not at the age of accountability. I don't even know what that means, but I heard it growing up, right? Like, they're just babies. Like, what? Why would you waste the teacher's time with this? And this gets Jesus all fired up, right? So when Jesus saw this, now his own disciples, his own apprentices, right? He's gonna just get frustrated. He says when Jesus saw this, he grew angry and said to them, "Allow the children to come to me. Don't forbid them, because God's kingdom belongs to people like these children." Now, as we've said in other spaces before, children in the first century world were not what you would consider like high on the priority chart as far as their value to society, right? Where today we understand, hopefully, that children are like so important. And from day one, from the day, actually even in the womb, study tell us that their personality, their ability to navigate reality, their ability to make good choices are all determined in so many ways by the adults in their lives from the moment they are incubating in mom's tummy. And what we know as well is that as Jesus followers in this story and a couple of other places, it's very clear that our responsibility is to do all that we can to say, okay, we're going to come alongside you in this journey. We're going to walk with you in this journey. And we understand that at least for the first 18 years, and someone said maybe a little longer, for the first 18 years, there needs to be trusted, wise, caring, compassionate, beautiful people of God who just love children well. And the disciples are so dense in this moment, they just don't get it. And this makes Jesus fired up. This makes him angry. Because Jesus gets angry when people are undervalued and excluded. Jesus gets angry when people are undervalued and excluded. Again, test your anger against the weight of your love. Jesus here is monitoring his anger in the loving context of these human beings matter. Quit treating them as though they're less than that. And let's be honest, in modern society, Christians sometimes struggle to treat everyone like a human being. This is kind of what we've done, right? Like over the long arc of history, if you're not part of my nation, then maybe you're a Christian, maybe you're not, but we're willing to go like toe to toe with you in a war because like you're not real Christians, we're real Christians, right? Or maybe we think about like the status of women throughout church history and how women have been treated, and even to the point where some women have been told, submit to your husband even if he's beating you because whatever, the Bible, which is just a bunch of terrible usages of the Bible. It's an excuse for men to sort of harness their anger, codify it as religious, and justify their sin. Right? Because over and over again, Christians just seem to get this one wrong. It's like, why aren't we in a place where if we're following Jesus, if Jesus is our teacher, our rabbi, and we're giving all that we have to him, how can we take the anger that is loaded with darkness within us, that kind of anger, and sort of just shove it down the throats of other people, shove it down the throats of children, shove it down the throats of people who are less maybe strong in the situation, and just be like, it's holy. I'll tell you why. Here's a chapter. Here's a verse. Any of you done with that, like malarkey? Like, let's just call it what it is. It is sin. But, one time in the Old Testament, stop. But there's a rod and stop. Like, if you applied, by the way, like, here's just a little nugget to go explore. I'm not even going to fix it for you. If you just sort of like looked at all of the things that, like, collectively the Bible says about how to rear a child, up until the New Testament at least, you know what you get? Sent to the jail cell. I mean, it's not always awesome. It's conditioned by thousands of years, right? That doesn't mean we pick and choose in the Bible, but we read the Bible through the lens of Jesus, who died for his enemies and refused to smack them back. What? But for some reason, we just got all this anger, and we're like, where can I create scapegoats for my anger so that my anger, I can't manage it, I can't deal with it, so you get a little anger, you get a little anger. Yeah, and apparently I'm Oprah, so whatever. Everyone gets anger. Gang, are we known by our love? Are we known by our hospitality? Are we known for the way that we look at a baby and say, you're inconvenient, but I don't care because you are cherished by God, right? Like, this is the way of Jesus. And it always moves us towards who's undervalued, who's excluded, who is like the withered hand man who Jesus said, you need to see him. You need to see him. So Jesus gets all fired up. I apparently do too. But like, this matters. This matters. One other story, Mark chapter 11. We're getting closer to the crucifixion of Jesus. There's a whole lot I could say about this passage. It's actually really sort of a pivot point in a lot of ways in the Gospel of Mark. Right before this, of course, Jesus will ride into Jerusalem and be hailed as like the Messiah, the King. They'll wave palm branches to him. And then you know what he does when he finally gets into the city? It's evening. And so he goes to the temple and he looks around. He's like, oh, it's evening. No one's here. All right, I'll come back later, right? And then after that, he has this interesting moment where he sees a fig tree and he's like, hey, fig tree, why aren't there fruits on you? And actually, it's the wrong season for fruit, which is just hilarious, right? But there's a point to that. He'll curse the fig tree and say, no more fruit for you. These are just weird things prophets do. Can we just say that? Like, Jesus is acting like a prophet from the Old Testament. Like sometimes they don't wear clothes. Like, there's all kinds of weird things prophets do in the Old Testament. And so one day he's just like, well, didn't see the temple thing yet, but fig tree, I'm not into you right now. Be dead, And then Jesus will do what we're going to read right now, which is a very famous incident. And then he'll walk by that fig tree and they'll be like, oh my gosh, look at it, it's actually withered away. Like, it's just fascinating. All of this has a point. Mark actually does this. It's called a Markan sandwich. Say that with me. It's very good. Markan sandwich. Markan sandwich. Mark-N because you want to sound academic, and sandwich because it tastes good, right? So basically, throughout Mark's gospel, you have these incidents where there's a thing, and a thing, and they all sort of are the same thing. Does that make sense? So that's why I kind of build out the context for you. And this is what happens in Mark's version of the story, which most historians think is the first version that was ever written down. So here we go. Mark 11, verse 15, it says, they came into Jerusalem. After entering the temple, he threw out those who were selling and buying there. He pushed over the tables used for currency exchange and the chairs of those who sold doves. He didn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He taught them, hasn't it been written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a hideout for crooks. The chief priests and legal experts heard this and tried to find a way to destroy him. They regarded him as dangerous because the whole crowd was enthralled at his teaching. So you kind of need a picture of what the visual is here, right? So he curses the tree, and then he goes to the temple. Now the temple has various sort of levels to it, and I should have given you a visual, so just track with me for a minute. I didn't give you a visual this week. But there's various sort of areas where different people had access. And so the outer court would be called the court of the nations or the court of the Gentiles, right? And so that would be a space where it didn't matter your nationality. You could go, and if you thought Israel's God was someone you wanted to explore or someone you wanted to worship, that was your space where you could do that. And then it goes there's a court for women, then men, and then right? It keeps on going towards the center all the way to the Holy of Holies. And what's fascinating is in this passage, Jesus is throwing stuff around. He's making a scene. By the way, he's being a prophet, right? Like in Israel's history, this is just what prophets do. In fact, this is called, in technical language, this is just simply called an enacted parable. An enacted parable. Basically meaning the action of the person is the parable itself. Does that make sense? So Jesus can verbalize parables and he can act out parable. And this is simply an action that has a bigger point than the action itself. And Jesus is clearly fired up. Jesus is very fired up. In fact, John's version, I'm going to give you one verse, but I'll give you a little more than that as far as context. John's version says this in verse 17 of John 2. It says, his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. Zeal for your house will consume me. And so Jesus is perceived in this moment as having zeal, as being fired up, right? Something about this situation grinds his gears. In fact, a lot of things grind his gears in this situation. There's a bunch of stuff going on. I mean, the first thing that I think is really important is that we recognize that this is happening in the court of the nations, the court of the Gentiles. And Jesus is like, but my house is supposed to be a prayer for all nations. So all nations are supposed to be able to pray here, but you've made the prayer area of the Gentiles, you've turned it into your foyer, right? You've basically said, this is where you can get more information about what dove you need to buy, and here's, you can't use pagan currency because that has images on it, so you got to switch it out, right? And so Jesus looks around and is like, hey, you're creating outsiders just by the way you're acting. You're not being the people who are a light to the world rather than an escape from the world for only a select few. This fires Jesus up. John says that he actually grabs a whip and kind of cracks it and gets the animals scurrying off and all of that. Here's what it doesn't say. For goodness sake, can I just say this out loud? It doesn't say Jesus hit people with a whip. Okay? So if anyone says, but, that one time Jesus got he didn't hit a human. Just hold that, okay? But he did do this. Make a big scene. Throw stuff around. Act like a prophet. Make a big deal of it. Why? Well, there's a couple of things that we've already alluded to. But I think what I love, I was reading this book that's really, really kind of fun. It's called What Made Jesus Mad? And one of the things that the author, Tim Harlow, said, I thought just was a good summary of this moment. He said, this isn't him just blowing his fuse suddenly. This was a thought out, slow-burning conviction about the access God wanted people to have to him. Isn't that good? So it's not like Jesus is like, I'm angry, I have to find something to take it out on. Jesus the prophet has been angry about this for a long time, so much so that he sort of tempers the situation by checking it out at night just a little bit. And then when the moment comes, he's like, fig tree, you stop producing fruit. In other words, Israel, you're not producing fruit anymore. Not like you're supposed to. And then he's like, hey, the money changing thing and the doves thing, like that's not wrong in and of itself, but you put it in the court of the Gentiles. You put it in a place where you're making a statement that says outsiders aren't welcome here. And Jesus is just done with that. And what's fascinating to me is that becomes the center. That becomes the center place where the Jewish people in the first century are conspiring together to overthrow Rome. It becomes sort of headquarters. Eventually, Rome gets kind of word of this in the late 60s of the first century. And what do? Well, the general who will become the emperor at one point, named Titus, comes with a bunch of armies, and they start to fight. And the temple literally becomes headquarters for the military. And Jesus in Mark 13, which we don't get to look at today, actually predicts it all way before it happens. He says, you see this building, this fancy building? Not even a single stone is going to be really left on one another. It's all going to fall down. So when you see these things happening, run for the hills, get out of Dodge, right? So Jesus, in a few chapters, is actually going to prep the disciples for this moment that's going to happen 40 or so years into the future. Why does this all matter? Jesus throws stuff around because, in one sense, he's saying, you want to keep outsiders on the outside? That sounds like the fuel of where this thing's going. That sounds like the fuel of, you're angry, you're oppressed, and yes, you can be oppressed. We get that, you're oppressed, and that's bad. But the path forward isn't this. In fact, this whole system is about to become pretty much obsolete. And so in zeal, in frustration, in anger, Jesus steps in and says, you can't do this anymore. You can't do this anymore. And he throws stuff around. He drives people away because his anger has a purpose. Jesus' anger is towards those who conspire to create systems that keep people out. Jesus is like, you can't do that. Like, God is for everyone. Jesus is like I am for everyone. And yes, there's like, if you want to become a disciple, you have to count the cost, and you got to follow me, and you got to live like a Jesus follower, and you're going to stumble in that sometimes. But you know what? As you stumble, there's grace to kind of realign yourself. And Jesus is like, look, don't keep people out because you don't think they're good enough. Jesus is fired up because of exclusion, because of injustice, because of an elitist attitude. And so Jesus is like, you know what? I'm angry. And I'm going to show you that anger. But notice there's no flying off the handle. Notice there's no sort of like unregulated fight or flight response in Jesus. He's actually taking his anger and investing it in something that actually is going to produce good. And so here's what I want to leave us with as we think about the emotion of anger. It's not sin in and of itself, but it can lead to sin. And Jesus shows us ways that it doesn't have to lead to sin. And so here's what I want to ask us. Is anger a habit or typically the outflow of love for you? Is your anger, when you get angry, is it just a habit? Like, I got angry because so-and-so stole time from me, and I should be doing this other thing, but they're just still. Maybe you're a parent and you have a kid who's having a meltdown. And in that meltdown moment, you're kind of like, I had plans for the next hour. I don't want to have to bear with this child until the child calms down and we can process this after their lid is no longer flipped. This is an offense. Like, you 4-year-old, and now I'm talking to myself, you 4-year-old, how dare you rob my next hour to 2 hours and making me have to bear with you and walk you through and actually parent you? How dare you? I was going to watch the next episode of Netflix on my iPhone while you all did things. How dare you offend me? How dare you, right? And this impulse for how dare you just runs in the face of Jesus, who's always driven by, if I am angry, I need to notice what it is, and I'm going to invest that anger in love, advocacy, coming alongside those who don't have a voice, coming alongside those who are being pressed in on for unjust reasons. So, does the habit of anger cause harm in your life? To yourself and to others? Or is anger an authentic emotion that's driven by a place like Jesus where it's like, I have to take action now. I have to care now. I have to sacrifice something of myself maybe now. Anger's a hard one. I'm not going to lie. Some of the best people I know have anger stuff that they walk with. This ain't a judgment session. This ain't me saying, look, if you have anger, you don't even like Jesus at all. It's an invitation to say, what if I could manage anger like Jesus? What if I could say, yeah, my angry impulse in this moment isn't the problem. It's how I manage it and how it sort of leaks into the relationships and spaces of my life. It's how it leaks into those social media moments where I just start typing in all caps because I'm just angry at the world right now. It's just big letters, right? I sometimes see that. Back when I was blogging a lot, I'd get those, and then it would be like, heretic, 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 big capital letters, and then, Old King James English, heretic, heretic, right? And it's just like, I'm going to communicate to you that you make me angry. Here's the deal. What if when we're driven to that space, we just say, no. There's something better. There's something to learn about myself as I go to the layer, beneath the layer, beneath the layer, beneath the layer. Is this about love or is this about self-preservation in this moment? Could we be that honest with ourselves? If you can get to a place where you're honest about what anger is doing in you and through you and where it's coming from in the first place, let me tell you something. People are going to look at your life and they're going to say, whoa, how did you manage to not react there? How did you manage to take that shot to the face there? How did you manage to love there? And you'll be able to say, you know what? It takes a lot of work, a lot of grace, and a whole lot of Jesus. Anger isn't the problem. How we hold it, that makes all the difference. I want to invite you to just sort of pause with me as we pray, and we're going to just sort of hold this together. And so, Jesus, thank you. Thank you that in the Bible, like in the New Testament, in the gospel accounts of your life, you actually show us anger, that you experienced anger. But it wasn't unmanaged. You didn't fly off the handle. You didn't lose yourself in the moment. In fact, you sort of like anchored into who you were because that anger was telling you that there's an injustice here, there's a wrong here, there's a religiosity here, there's a gatekeeping kind of impulse here. And in the moments when you could have gotten mad, they're spitting on you as you carry your own cross. You don't get mad, you forgive. Help us to be more like you. Help us to hold our emotion more like you. God, you're so kind. Help us when we trip up, rather than to self-analyze in a judgmental way, to actually say, wait a second. Maybe I can learn and do something different next time. Jesus, would you help us? We give you all of our emotional life. We know it's of you and from you when we use it like you. We give you all of ourselves. In the mighty name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.